A lone traveler ventured into the icy wilderness of the tundra after a severe blizzard and stumbled upon a huge plane frozen in the snow. What he found inside changed everything. Subscribe and write where you're watching this video from. Marcus Hale stood in the narrow hallway of his small apartment, staring at the half-packed duffel bag on the floor as if it might give him an answer he didn't already know. The dim winter light pushing through the blinds made the peeling paint on the walls look even more lifeless, and the muted hum of the refrigerator in the next room was the only sound. In the last 12 months, everything he had thought of as permanent had crumbled. At 38 years old, he had been an aircraft mechanic for nearly 2 decades, working his way up from a junior technician to a senior engineer on the line at an aviation plant in Detroit. He could talk about hydraulic systems, avionics, and fuselage repairs with the ease of a man who had dedicated his life to the craft. He had thought that kind of loyalty meant stability. Then, almost without warning, the plant closed its doors, swallowing not just his job, but the jobs of hundreds of others. The severance package barely covered 2 months' rent. Losing the job was a blow, but losing Tasha was the one that gutted him. They had been engaged for almost a year, planning a small wedding in the spring. She said she loved him, but she also said she couldn't be with a man who, in her words, had no plan for the future. She packed her things one Saturday morning, her eyes darting away from his as if looking too long might cement her guilt. He didn't try to stop her. In the weeks that followed, the apartment seemed too big and too small at the same time. He sold the engagement ring back to the jeweler for a fraction of what he'd paid, sold his car to clear some of the mountain bills, and moved into a smaller place with thin walls and a view of a brick alley. The days bled together. He would wake up late, scroll aimlessly through job listings, and stare out the window at the same cracked pavement below. It was during one of those afternoons that the idea came to him, not as a sudden burst of inspiration, but as a slow, insistent whisper. He needed to get out. Not just out of the apartment or the city, but out of the stale air of his life. The thought of going somewhere so far removed from everything he knew became a fixed point in his mind. He remembered his father taking him on camping trips in the Upper Peninsula when he was a boy. They would fish in the mornings, cook over an open flame at night, and sleep under skies so dark the stars looked close enough to touch. Those were the only times he could recall feeling completely untethered from the world's demands. Maybe, if he could find that feeling again, he could figure out what to do next. Marcus began researching possible routes and settled on the idea of hiking deep into the Canadian tundra. It would be cold, brutally cold, but it would also be quiet, vast, and empty. He mapped out a plan, travel to a small northern town reachable by bus, then hike 30 kilometers into the wilderness, camp for 2 nights, and loop back. No phones, no deadlines, no one asking him what came next. Just snow, sky, and whatever thoughts surfaced in the silence. He knew he would have to be careful. The tundra was not forgiving, especially in winter. He made a list of what he needed: a sturdy tent, a high-rated sleeping bag, thermal blankets, a gas stove, a compact axe, a reliable compass, and old-fashioned paper maps, in case the compass failed. He added a multi-tool to the list, remembering how many problems a good one could solve. For food, he chose items with high caloric value and long shelf life: dehydrated meals, protein bars, and a small supply of canned goods. He would bring just enough for the journey there and back, with a little extra for emergencies. 2 days before his departure, he stood in a small outfitter's shop in town. The smell of wool and canvas thick in the air, handing over the last of his saved cash for the gear he still lacked. The shop owner, a wiry man with weathered hands, made a comment about the weather patterns up north this time of year. A storm was moving through, he said. If Marcus timed it right, he could wait out the worst of it in town before heading into the open country. Marcus nodded, thinking that it might actually work to his advantage. Fresh snow could wipe clean the footprints of the world. When the morning came, he boarded a bus headed north, the duffel bag heavy with gear beside him. The city gave way to stretches of forest, then to smaller and smaller towns until the houses were separated by wide, white fields. He got off at the last stop, a cluster of buildings that made up the town's main street. The air was sharper here, cutting into his lungs with each breath. He found a cheap room above a diner, its single window facing the snowy street below. He spent the rest of the day spreading out his maps on the bed, tracing his intended route with the tip of a pen. He marked possible camp spots and water sources, checking distances twice. He could feel the old methodical side of himself coming back, the part that planned every step of a repair before picking up a tool. Outside, the first flakes began to fall, swirling past the street lamps like restless ghosts. By nightfall, the wind was up, and the snow was coming harder, rattling the window pane. Marcus sat on the edge of the bed, lacing and unlacing his boots, listening to the storm build. He wasn't afraid of it. If anything, he felt a strange calm. The storm would pass, and when it did, he would walk out into a world transformed. No one would know where he was. No one would expect him back at a certain time. It would be just him and the tundra, and maybe, somewhere in that frozen expanse, he'd find the clarity he'd been missing. The following morning, the blizzard was in full force. Snow came down in dense sheets, and the wind howled between the buildings. He had no choice but to wait it out. For 2 days, he stayed inside, venturing out only to grab a hot meal from the diner downstairs, watching as drifts climbed higher and the streets emptied. The townspeople moved quickly when they did go out, heads down, collars up. Marcus kept to himself, content to bide his time. On the third morning, the storm broke. The sky was a pale, endless blue, and sunlight bounced off the fresh snow in blinding flashes. Marcus finished packing, double-checked his gear, and slung the bag over his shoulder. He stepped outside into air so cold it made his teeth ache. His boots sank into the powder with a satisfying crunch, and the only sound was the rhythmic creak of leather straps shifting under the weight of his pack. He left the town behind quickly, following the route he had traced so many times on his map. The first few kilometers were easy, the snow firm underfoot, the land gently rolling. But the farther he went, the deeper the snow became, forcing him to lift his legs higher with each step. His breath puffed out in sharp clouds that hung in the air before dissolving. The land stretched away in all directions, vast and silent, a white ocean broken only by the occasional cluster of dark trees. With each step, the noise of his life, the arguments, the rejections, the endless questions about the future, faded a little more. Here, there was only the steady rhythm of his body moving through the cold and the distant promise of a place to pitch his tent before nightfall. He didn't know what he would find out there, or if he would find anything at all. But he knew there was no turning back now. The point of no return had already passed the moment he stepped into the snow. The snow was deeper than Marcus had anticipated, even for the tundra in the days after a storm. Each step seemed to vanish into a powdery void that swallowed his boots past the ankles, forcing him to push against an invisible weight. The air was crisp and unyielding, a cold so absolute it made him aware of every exposed inch of skin. The sun was out in full force now, reflecting off the unbroken white and stabbing at his eyes until he pulled his hood lower and adjusted the scarf around his face. The storm had been a brute. 2 days of relentless wind and snow that kept him penned up in the small town, watching from the window as the streets turned into white corridors. Now that it had passed, the world was unrecognizable. He could still remember that morning when the storm finally died. The silence had been uncanny. After days of hearing the constant roar and whistle of wind between buildings, the sudden stillness felt almost intrusive. Even in the middle of town, the snow lay undisturbed, covering cars up to their wheel wells and drifting against storefronts. There was no movement except for the thin tendrils of smoke curling from chimneys and the occasional shape of a bundled figure hurrying from one doorway to another. Marcus had eaten a slow breakfast at the diner, watching the steam rise from his coffee, and decided there was no more reason to wait. Now, several hours into his hike, the last of the town had long since faded behind him. The path he'd planned was buried under a fresh blanket of snow, leaving him to navigate by the low hills and the sparse, frost-coated trees that dotted the expanse. His map stayed tucked inside his jacket to keep the paper from stiffening in the cold, but he checked it periodically, pulling off a glove with reluctant fingers to trace his position. Every landmark seemed slightly altered, softened by the storm into strange shapes, as if the land itself had shifted while he was gone. The first stretch had been easier, with the terrain sloping gently upward. But as the morning wore on, the ground rose more sharply, and the snow seemed to cling more stubbornly to his boots. His thighs burned with the effort, and his breath came in short bursts, sending plumes of vapor into the frozen air. He took short breaks, leaning on his trekking pole, scanning the horizon for the familiar outline of the ridge he'd marked on his route. It would be the highest point for kilometers in any direction, and from there, he expected to see the open field beyond, a wide, flat stretch of snow where he could orient himself before heading toward his first campsite. When he finally crested the slope, the field did come into view, a vast and dazzling expanse of white beneath a sky so pale it seemed drained of all color. But something was wrong. The surface of the snow below was mostly smooth, broken only by occasional drifts, yet in the center of it all, perhaps 100 meters away, was a shape that didn't belong. At first, Marcus thought it might be a boulder, dark and irregular against the uniform whiteness. He squinted, adjusting the brim of his hood to shield his eyes from the glare. The longer he stared, the less it looked like stone. The edges were too clean, the surface too smooth in places, and the color, though dulled by frost, wasn't the muted gray of rock, but something metallic. His stomach tightened with a flicker of intrigue. Out here, so far from any road or settlement, the chances of finding something man-made were slim. And yet, there it was, half buried and waiting. He felt a pull toward it, as irrational as it was strong. Whatever it was, it didn't belong here. That alone was enough to demand his attention. He descended the slope carefully, planting each step to keep from slipping on the packed crust beneath the fresh snow. The wind had picked up slightly, brushing against him in irregular gusts, and with each step the shape ahead became more defined. By the time he was halfway across the field, he could see rivets along its side, lines that curved in ways nature never intended. His pace slowed as realization began to take shape. When he was close enough to reach out a gloved hand, he brushed away a layer of snow and ice, revealing a dull sheen of metal. The surface was battered, dented in places, and streaked with long, frozen cracks. He stepped back, letting his gaze travel along what he could see of it. It wasn't just a piece of scrap. This was part of a fuselage, an aircraft, large enough that what lay exposed was only a fraction of its full length. Snow had swallowed most of it, but the protruding section was unmistakable. The storm had shifted enough of the drifts to uncover it, like the hand of some invisible giant brushing aside a cover. Marcus's breath quickened, sending clouds of steam into the frigid air. He didn't know much about commercial flight routes in this part of Canada, but he knew enough to recognize that this was no small bush plane. The metal was thick, the construction solid, something built to carry dozens, maybe even more. But there was no sign of debris scattered across the ice, no telltale field of wreckage. Either the rest of it was still buried, or whatever had happened here had contained the damage to this single spot. Curiosity pressed at him, urging him closer. He began to circle the exposed section, his boots crunching through crusted snow. Frost clung to the metal in uneven patches, and in one place, jagged edges of torn aluminum jutted outward like frozen petals. Near what appeared to be the base of a wing, he found a door, sealed shut and encased in ice so thick it looked as though it had grown there over decades. He reached for the handle out of reflex, but it was locked fast, frozen solid against the cold. He stepped back, his mind turning over the possibilities. The door could be opened with enough heat, but that would take time and resources, both of which he had to consider carefully in this environment. Still, the idea of walking away gnawed at him. He had come out here seeking silence, maybe a measure of peace, but the tundra had delivered something else entirely. A secret buried under years of snow, one that the storm had, by pure chance, revealed to him. The wind shifted again, and Marcus glanced toward the horizon. The light was already changing, the sun beginning its slow arc downward, casting long shadows across the field. He couldn't spend much longer out here before setting up camp. Yet the thought of leaving without learning more felt almost unbearable. He stood there for a long moment, boots planted in the snow, listening to the faint groan of the metal in the cold. In the end, he turned towards the small cluster of trees at the edge of the field. He would need wood for a fire if he wanted to make any progress with the frozen door. His plan for the night began to take shape. Not at his intended campsite, but here, beside this relic of the sky. He could feel the weight of the storm's gift, as if it had carved open the landscape just for him, and he knew that whatever lay inside was now part of his journey. The cold had a way of seeping into Marcus's bones, no matter how many layers he wore. By the time he reached the tree line, his fingers were aching, and his legs felt leaden from trudging through the deep snow. The small grove was a cluster of black spruce, their branches heavy with ice. He paused for a moment, drawing in the sharp, resinous scent and listening to the faint creak of wood in the wind. The place felt untouched, like it had been waiting through countless winters for someone to disturb it. He pulled the hatchet from his pack and set to work, chipping away at frozen branches, looking for dry wood beneath the surface. Even the smallest twigs resisted his blade, brittle with frost, but persistence paid off. Soon, he had an armful of usable kindling and a few thicker pieces for sustained heat. When he returned to the plain, the shadows had lengthened across the snow, and the light was beginning to fade towards that pale amber that preceded the tundra's night. The aircraft loomed ahead, its curved metal catching the last of the sun's rays, the frost glittering like a crust of diamonds. Up close, it felt even more immense, though Marcus knew he was seeing only a fraction of it. The rest lay entombed beneath years of snow, hidden from the world until the storm had pulled back the curtain. He dropped the wood near the frozen door and crouched down to examine it again. The handle was a stubborn block of ice, the edges fused to the frame. He ran a gloved hand over the surface, noting the patches where frost had built up in jagged ridges. The metal felt alien in the vastness of the tundra, a piece of another world stranded here in silence. He set about building the fire, clearing a small space near the base of the fuselage where the snow was shallower, packing it down with the flat of his boot until it formed a compact layer. He stacked the kindling in a careful cone, tucking bits of torn cloth from his pack into the base as tinder. His hands worked quickly, muscle memory from years of camping with his father guiding each movement. It took longer than he liked for the flame to catch. The air was so dry and the cold so invasive that the fire seemed reluctant to grow. But when it finally did, it burned with a determined steadiness, sending ribbons of heat toward the door. Marcus fed it more wood, keeping the flames close enough to soften the ice without risking damage to the metal. The process was slow, and the light faded further with each passing minute. Above him, the sky shifted from pale gold to a deepening indigo, the first stars pricking through. He decided he would camp here for the night, the plane at his back, and the fire between him and the cold. He pitched his tent a short distance away, anchoring it against the wind, then returned to tend the flames. Each time he checked the door, the ice seemed to yield a little more, water beginning to bead along the edges before refreezing in delicate crystals. It would take hours, perhaps until morning, to loosen it completely. That was fine. He wasn't in a hurry anymore. The plane had waited this long. It could wait one more night. He ate a simple meal from his rations, sitting cross-legged by the fire, the glow casting flickering patterns across the weathered metal. His mind wandered to the circumstances that might have brought this aircraft here. The tundra had claimed many things: ships, vehicles, even entire expeditions, but a plane of this size was no small loss. The absence of scattered wreckage troubled him. Whatever happened here hadn't been the chaotic, widespread disaster he'd expect from a mid-air collision or uncontrolled crash. This looked contained, almost deliberate. The wind picked up during the night, sighing through the empty shell of the fuselage and carrying with it a faint, hollow resonance. Marcus lay in his tent, listening, the sound slipping into his dreams and pulling him back to wakefulness more than once. When the first light of dawn seeped into the sky, he was already up, coaxing the embers back into flame. He could see where the heat had eaten away at the ice around the handle, leaving small gaps. He added more wood, feeling the door's surface with his bare hand briefly before snatching it back from the cold bite. It was getting there. By mid-morning, the ice was thin enough that he decided to try. Wrapping both hands around the handle, he braced his feet and pulled. At first, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like breaking bone, the frozen seal gave way and the door shifted, groaning on its hinges. He exhaled a plume of frosty breath and pulled again, harder this time, until it swung open enough for him to peer inside. The air that escaped was stale with a faint metallic tang, colder even than the wind outside. He climbed up, boots crunching on a thin crust of frost that coated the threshold. Inside, the dim light filtered through the few windows not obscured by snow. Rows of seats stretched ahead, their fabric split and spilling pale stuffing, armrests bent at odd angles. Overhead, compartments hung open, their contents long gone or scattered. A thin layer of ice coated nearly every surface, glittering faintly in the cold light. Marcus stepped carefully down the aisle, his breath echoing in the dead air. Here and there, personal effects had been left behind. A cracked watch face, a notebook swollen and warped from moisture, a single leather glove lying between two seats. He paused at each, resisting the urge to disturb them. The stillness of the place was almost sacred, and breaking it felt wrong. Toward the rear, he noticed the floor didn't sit quite right. A panel near the last row was raised slightly, just enough to catch the light. He crouched, running his hand over the seam. It was flush in most places, but here it was uneven, as though something beneath had shifted. He was still examining it when a faint sound reached him, muffled, irregular, like something knocking far away. He straightened, listening. The noise stopped. He told himself it was the wind, threading its way through the broken seals and hollow spaces of the fuselage. But even as he thought it, another sound followed, a soft creak, then silence again. A prickling sensation ran along the back of his neck. He glanced around the cabin, the fire outside now a dim memory through the doorway. He wasn't alone here. The realization settled over him with a weight he couldn't explain. Something had brought this plane to rest in the middle of the tundra. Something had kept it buried for years, and now something inside had just reminded him that the wreck was not as empty as it seemed. The stillness inside the fuselage was deceptive. Marcus stood halfway down the narrow aisle, his eyes adjusting to the dimness, his breath curling in faint streams that quickly dissipated in the frigid air. The sound he had heard moments ago lingered in his mind, impossible to explain away as a trick of wind or settling metal. The wreck had the air of a tomb, its silence thick and heavy, and yet that silence had been broken. His boots crunched faintly over the frost-dusted floor as he moved toward the rear, the raised panel in the flooring still in his mind, though he forced himself to take in the surroundings more deliberately. The cabin seemed to have been frozen in a moment of abrupt finality. Seat cushions were split and spilling their innards, their fabric stiff from years of cold. Overhead, compartments sagged open, a few still holding indistinct shapes beneath a coating of ice. In some seats, seat belts were still latched as though expecting passengers to return. He paused to study the personal debris scattered here and there. A child's plastic figurine, its colors faded but still bright against the dull surroundings. A battered leather wallet frozen to the floor. A page from what might once have been a diary. Its ink bled into unreadable swirls. The air had a peculiar tang, the metallic bite of cold iron mingled with something older, more organic, the scent of things long sealed away from light and warmth. It made him think of basements abandoned for decades, of spaces where time stood still but not without cost. His breath sounded too loud, each inhale and exhale marking his presence in a place that had not known company in years. He approached the rear section slowly, each step sending small crackles through the frost beneath his soles. The uneven panel drew his attention again, its edges dusted with ice yet distinctly out of alignment with the surrounding floor. Kneeling beside it, he ran his gloved hand along the seam. It was flush along one side, but on the other, the gap was wide enough to admit the tip of his finger. As he pressed gently, he thought he felt a faint give, as though the panel was designed to move. That was when it came again. The sound. Not loud, not sharp, but unmistakably deliberate. A soft, measured tapping, like knuckles or nails against metal, somewhere beyond the bulkhead. Marcus froze, his breath halting mid-inhale. The noise was too steady to be a random shift in the wreckage. It stopped after 3 or 4 beats, leaving the air heavier than before. He waited, straining to hear anything beyond the faint creak of the fuselage in the wind. For a long moment, there was nothing, and then a different sound emerged. A low, almost imperceptible scrape, like fabric brushing over a hard surface. It seemed to come from farther back, perhaps beyond a partition he couldn't yet see. Marcus stood, his body instinctively tensing, though he told himself there was nothing here to fear. Whatever this was, it was simply a mystery to be understood, not an immediate threat. Still, the fine hairs along his arms prickled beneath his layers. He stepped towards the very end of the cabin, where a narrow door led to what would have been the galley or lavatory section. The door hung slightly ajar, its latch broken, and a delicate rime of frost lined its edges. He pushed it open with the tip of his boot, the hinges protesting with a long groan. Beyond was a cramped space, dim even in the filtered daylight from the half-covered windows. Empty compartments gaped open above a counter layered with frost, and in one corner a metal panel stood out against the wall, its surface cleaner than the rest, as though it had been touched more recently. He stepped closer, brushing snow crystals from its edges. His fingers found a recess, too deliberate to be damaged, where a latch might be concealed. The panel gave under pressure, shifting just enough to reveal the narrowest of cracks. From within that crack came a faint exhalation of air, colder even than the rest of the plane, and carrying with it a scent that was not entirely unpleasant, but unfamiliar. A mixture of aged cloth, sealed air, and something faintly acrid. He leaned in, listening, his pulse loud in his ears. For a moment there was only silence, and then, from the darkness beyond, he thought he heard movement. It was slow, cautious, as if whatever was inside had been stirred into wakefulness by his presence. A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold ran down his spine. The plane had been here for years, maybe decades. It was absurd to imagine anyone or anything surviving in such conditions, and yet his senses told him otherwise. He thought of the fire outside, still smoldering faintly, and the vast, empty field around them. He was alone out here. If there was something behind that panel, there was no one else to deal with it but him. He backed away slightly, his gaze sweeping the cramped space for anything that might help him force the opening wider. There was a metal bar near the floor, perhaps part of the plane's structure, half broken from whatever impact had occurred. He gripped it, feeling its icy chill through his gloves, and wedged the end into the seam. The panel resisted at first, then yielded with a reluctant groan, opening enough for him to see a sliver of what lay beyond. The space inside was narrow and dark, the walls closer together than the cabins, and the floor appeared to slope slightly downward. The beam of daylight that filtered through the gap barely reached the back, leaving most of it in shadow. He thought he saw shapes, indistinct but suggestive of stored supplies or equipment. Then, from deeper within, a figure emerged into the faint light. Marcus felt his breath catch. It was a man, or what was left of one after too many years in a place like this. His clothes were a patchwork of fabrics, wrapped tightly around his frame, and his face was pale beneath an uneven beard. The eyes that met Marcus's were sunken but sharp, glittering with something between fear and disbelief. The man's lips moved as if to speak, but no sound came, and then he reached out, one hand bracing against the edge of the panel as though the act of standing there cost him more than Marcus could imagine. For a heartbeat, neither moved. The air between them seemed fragile, as if a single wrong motion could shatter it. Marcus realized with a clarity that cut through the haze of shock that he was looking at someone who had been alive inside this plane for far longer than anyone should have been. The tapping, the scrape, the sense of not being alone, It all resolved into this single, impossible truth. He stepped forward cautiously, the questions flooding his mind too many to form into words. The man's breath fogged faintly in the cold, each exhale a testament to the years of endurance it must have taken to survive in this place. Whatever had happened here, whatever had kept this aircraft hidden and silent for so long, had also kept this man prisoner within its shell. Marcus knew, without deciding it, that he could not turn away now. The tundra had revealed its secret to him, and he would see it through no matter what it took. For a long, suspended moment, neither of them moved. The man in the narrow passage stood braced against the edge of the panel as though it were the only thing keeping him upright, his eyes locked on Marcus with a strange mix of wariness and yearning. Marcus could hear his own pulse in his ears, the sound loud against the muffled quiet of the wreck. The cold air in the compartment was sharper, almost biting, and it seemed to roll out in waves from the darkness behind the man, bringing with it the faint odor of long-sealed space, of aged metal and cloth that had not known the sun in years. Marcus took a cautious step closer, his boots scraping softly over the frost-slick floor. Up close, the man's condition was even more apparent. His face was gaunt, cheekbones sharp beneath sallow skin that looked almost translucent in the dim light. A beard, thick and unkempt, framed his mouth, and from beneath the heavy wraps of mismatched fabric around his body protruded thin wrists and trembling hands. His eyes, though dulled by fatigue, still held a spark of awareness, and Marcus realized with a kind of stunned awe that he was looking at someone who had been fighting for life in the most impossible of circumstances. The man shifted slightly, his knees seeming to buckle, and Marcus instinctively moved forward, one hand lifting in a gesture meant to steady him. The movement seemed to break some invisible barrier between them. The man exhaled, the sound a hoarse whisper of breath that carried more relief than fear. Marcus could see that the fabrics wrapped around him were layers of scavenged material, strips of seat upholstery, torn pieces of insulation, what looked like sections of an old blanket. They were tied and knotted with strips of wire or cord, creating a cocoon against the killing cold. Behind him, the narrow compartment stretched away into shadow. As Marcus's eyes adjusted, he began to pick out shapes, stacked metal cases, the dull outlines of sealed containers, and, near the far end, a crude sleeping platform built from folded panels and layered with whatever padding could be found. Empty cans and torn wrappers were piled neatly in one corner, as though even in this isolation the man had imposed a kind of order on his world. The realization began to sink in. This was not a random hiding place. It was an emergency compartment, perhaps originally designed to store equipment or serve as an auxiliary space. It had been repurposed for survival, turned into a sanctuary when the rest of the world had been cut off. Marcus felt the weight of it, the years of solitude, the careful rationing of supplies, the grim determination it must have taken to stay alive here. The man tried to speak, his lips parting to form words, but what emerged was no more than a rasp, his voice too dry and weak from disuse. Marcus shook his head gently, signaling that there was no need to push himself yet. He reached into his pack, pulling out the water flask he carried, and offered it. The man hesitated, his gaze flicking between Marcus and the flask, and then, with trembling hands, he accepted it. He drank in slow sips, pausing between each as though to savor the sensation. When he handed it back, Marcus stepped aside, allowing more light from the cabin to fall into the opening. The man blinked rapidly, his pupils contracting at the brightness, and Marcus realized that it might have been months, even years, since he had seen anything more than the dim glow of whatever light source he had here. That glow, Marcus now noticed, came from a small, jury-rigged lamp near the sleeping platform, likely battery-powered, its light dim but steady. Marcus's mind spun with questions. How long had he been here? What had happened to the others who might have been on board? How had he survived in such a place through the unrelenting winters of the tundra? But now was not the time for questions. The man's condition made it clear that every moment they spent here was a gamble. The cold was deepening outside, and though this compartment had kept him alive, Marcus doubted it could do so much longer now that it had been opened to the elements. He gestured toward the cabin and then the fire outside, trying to communicate that they needed to move, to get to warmth. The man seemed to understand. He braced himself against the wall, pushing away from it with visible effort. Marcus reached out again, and this time the man didn't flinch from the touch. The weight of his body against Marcus's arm was startling. He was lighter than expected, the bulk of his layers disguising just how much strength he had lost. Together, they maneuvered out of the narrow compartment and into the cabin. The man moved slowly, each step deliberate, his breath quickening with the effort. Marcus kept a steadying arm around him, guiding him along the aisle and toward the open door. Outside, the fire was still smoldering, its heat a faint promise in the icy air. As they emerged, the man's eyes widened against the sudden glare of daylight, and he winced as if it physically hurt to see so much open space after so long in confinement. They made their way to the fire, and Marcus lowered him to sit on the insulated pad he had been using himself. The man hunched forward, holding his hands toward the flames, though Marcus could see that the trembling in his arms was more from weakness than cold. He unzipped his pack again, pulling out a thermal blanket and wrapping it snugly around the man's shoulders, then took one of the high-calorie meal pouches from his food supply. While the man ate, slowly, chewing with care as though each bite had to be measured, Marcus allowed himself to glance back toward the plane. The open door gaped like the mouth of some frozen giant, and he thought of the years it had sat here under snow and ice, hiding its secrets. He wondered how many storms had passed overhead without disturbing the man inside. How many rescue parties might have searched the area without ever finding this place. The tundra was vast and merciless, capable of swallowing anything whole. When the man finished eating, he leaned back slightly, his eyes closing for a moment as though the simple act of warmth and food was almost too much to process. Marcus didn't press him to speak. Instead, he sat nearby, adding wood to the fire, his own mind moving between the immediate practicalities of survival, getting them both to safety, and the enormity of what had just happened. He thought of his original plan, the 30-kilometer loop, the nights in solitude that he had envisioned as a kind of therapy. That plan no longer mattered. He wasn't just a hiker now. He was responsible for another life, one that had been sustained against all odds, and the path ahead would have to change completely. Whatever answers the man might give about the past would come in time. For now, there was only one truth that mattered. They had to get out of here alive. The fire crackled softly, its warmth pushing back against the cold. Beyond the circle of its light, the tundra stretched away in all directions, white and endless, as if they were the only two people left in the world. And perhaps, Marcus thought, in this place at this moment, they were. The man's breathing had steadied somewhat in the glow of the fire, but Marcus could see that each inhale still carried a weight of exhaustion that no single meal and blanket could erase. His skin, visible at the edges of his beard and beneath the layers of makeshift clothing, was tinged with a faint bluish pallor, the kind that spoke of years of exposure to cold air even in shelter. Marcus watched him from the corner of his eye, keeping his movements quiet, aware that this was not the moment for questions. The man's gaze drifted from the flames to the snow beyond, lingering there as though reacquainting himself with the idea of open space. It struck Marcus that the tundra might seem more alien to him now than the narrow compartment he had called home for so long. The afternoon light was beginning to pale again, casting the long shadows that marked the short winter days. Marcus knew they couldn't afford to lose more time. The cold here was not merely uncomfortable, it was a predator, patient and merciless, and once darkness fell, the temperature would plunge into a range that no amount of layering could truly defeat. He leaned forward, adjusting the logs in the fire, and felt the pull in his muscles from the long trek that had brought him here. Fatigue would be his own enemy in the hours ahead. He opened his pack again, taking stock. There was enough food to see them through to the nearest settlement if they rationed carefully, but water would be an ongoing task. Melting snow over the fire, filling flasks, keeping them from freezing solid during the march. The greater concern was the man's ability to walk. Even sitting upright seemed to require conscious effort, and Marcus could feel the frailty in the way he leaned when Marcus had helped him earlier. Still, leaving him here was unthinkable. The plane had been his prison as much as his sanctuary, and with its door now open, the thin insulation it had offered would bleed away what little heat it could retain. Marcus pulled the thermal blanket more snugly around the man's shoulders, then pointed toward the horizon in the direction he knew the nearest settlement lay. The man's eyes followed the gesture, though his expression remained unreadable. He nodded faintly, almost imperceptibly, as if conceding that the journey was inevitable. Marcus began packing up his camp, stowing his gear with the efficiency of habit, but he kept the fire burning until the last possible moment, letting its warmth sink deep into their bones. When it was time to go, Marcus knelt beside the man and gestured for him to rise. The effort was clearly taxing. The man's legs shook beneath him, and for a moment, Marcus thought he might not manage it. But he did, swaying slightly before Marcus slid an arm firmly around his back. The weight was startling, not heavy, but unsteady, as if each step would need to be negotiated in partnership. Marcus adjusted the straps of his pack and braced himself for the slow pace that lay ahead. The first steps away from the plane were the hardest. The man glanced back once, his eyes tracing the curve of the fuselage, now half in shadow, the frost along its skin glinting faintly in the dying light. It occurred to Marcus that he might never see it again, and that thought might carry a complicated mix of relief and grief. Marcus didn't pause to consider it too long. The cold was already pressing in around them, and the long, open stretch to the line of hills ahead offered no protection from the wind that was beginning to rise. The rhythm of their movement settled into a slow, deliberate cadence. Marcus kept to the packed snow where possible, avoiding the deeper drifts that would sap the man's remaining strength. Each step was measured, each pause, a chance to catch their breath without letting the cold seep too deep. Marcus kept speaking softly, not words meant to demand an answer, but the low, steady cadence of a human voice, a reminder that they were not alone in this frozen silence. As the sky deepened into the deep blue of late afternoon, Marcus began scanning for a place to camp before full dark. Pushing too far tonight could break them both. He spotted a low rise ahead, its slope partially sheltering a cluster of stunted spruce. It would cut some of the wind and offer enough space to pitch the tent and build another fire. Reaching it took longer than he'd hoped. The man stumbled twice, once nearly going to his knees, and Marcus had to haul him back upright with a force that left them both panting. But they made it, and Marcus settled him onto the insulated pad before turning to the tasks of survival. The fire came first, coaxed to life with the last of the driest kindling, and the heat still lingering in Marcus's muscles from the march. Snow melted into water over the small stove, filling the flask again, and the faint scent of rehydrating food joined the sharper tang of burning wood. The man ate slowly once more, his hands cupping the pouch as though drawing as much warmth from it as sustenance. In the flicker of the flames, his face looked more human than ghostly now, the color returning in faint streaks to his cheeks. When they settled into the tent, Marcus made sure the man was wrapped in every layer available. The thermal blanket cocooned around him, his head covered to trap whatever heat his body could generate. Outside, the wind whistled low over the rise, a sound that would have kept Marcus awake under other circumstances, but fatigue pressed at him with relentless insistence. Still, he lay awake for a time, listening to the man's breathing in the dark. It was steady, if shallow, a fragile reminder that he was still here, still fighting. Dawn came muted, the pale light diffused through a thin veil of cloud. Marcus roused the man gently, offering water and a few bites of food before they began breaking camp. The day would demand more from both of them, more distance, more cold, more endurance, and Marcus steeled himself for it. His own body ached, his shoulders sore from the weight of the pack and the constant bracing against the wind, but there was no room for complaint. They walked because they had to, because stopping for too long would mean the cold winning its slow, inevitable argument. The miles blurred into a pattern of motion and rest, motion and rest. Marcus watched the man carefully for signs of collapse, but each time the man seemed to find some hidden reserve, pushing forward a few more steps, then a few more. The settlement was still distant, but Marcus knew they were drawing closer with each passing hour. The air felt subtly different, the wind carrying a sharper scent, as though touched by wood smoke too faint to see. As the second day of their trek drew to a close, Marcus found himself thinking back to the moment he had first seen the shape in the snow, to the pull that had driven him toward it without hesitation. He had set out on this journey in search of something he couldn't name, and instead he had been given a life to carry through the frozen wilderness. The weight of that responsibility sat on his shoulders as tangibly as his pack, but there was no regret in it. When they stopped for the night, Marcus built the fire higher than before, feeding it steadily until the warmth pushed back the edge of the cold. The man sat close, his eyes fixed on the flames as though committing them to memory. Marcus didn't ask what he was thinking. Some silences were too full to break. Tomorrow, he told himself, they would see the first signs of the road. Tomorrow, they would be closer to safety. And though the tundra stretched out around them in all its indifferent vastness, Marcus felt, for the first time since leaving the town, that they might actually make it back. The thought settled into him quietly, like the steady beat of a heart that refused to stop. The third day dawned beneath a sky that had taken on a thin, silver cast, the pale light filtering through layers of cloud that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. Marcus woke before the man, lying still in his sleeping bag for a moment to listen. The wind had dropped overnight, leaving the air unnervingly still, but the cold was deeper than before, the kind that seemed to slip beneath the skin and settle into the bones. He could see his breath drifting toward the ceiling of the tent in slow, deliberate streams. Beside him, The man lay bundled in the thermal blanket and every scrap of clothing they could spare, his breathing even but shallow. Marcus knew they couldn't linger. He roused him gently, offering a few mouthfuls of water and a small portion of food, aware that each calorie mattered now more than ever. The man accepted both without protest, chewing slowly, his eyes distant as though still half in sleep. When Marcus began to break down the camp, the man stirred enough to help in small ways, folding the blanket, securing loose straps, but his movements were stiff, each one deliberate and cautious. Marcus felt the weight of the hours ahead pressing in before they had even taken the first step. The snow was firmer today, crusted by the night's cold so that their boots sank less deeply, though the air bit harder at exposed skin. Marcus kept his arm looped under the man's for balance, guiding him across the flat stretch that lay between them and the faint rise of hills he knew marked the edge of the open tundra. Beyond those hills, the land began to fold into shallow valleys and frozen rivers, and somewhere beyond that lay the settlement. He kept his eyes on that horizon, measuring the distance not in miles but in the stubborn endurance it would take to cross it. By midday, a faint scent reached them on the wind, thin but unmistakable. Wood smoke. Marcus stopped for a moment, lifting his head, inhaling deeply. The man beside him seemed to catch it too. His head turned slightly, and for the first time since they had left the wreck, Marcus thought he saw something like recognition in his eyes. The smell meant people. Fires burning in stoves, roofs to hold back the cold. It meant they were close enough that the land itself was changing. The hills came slowly, their slopes gentle but still demanding effort from tired legs. The man stumbled more frequently here, and Marcus slowed their pace to keep from pushing him past his limits. They paused often, resting on patches of windswept ground where the snow had thinned, sipping water that Marcus kept tucked inside his jacket to keep from freezing. Each time they stopped, Marcus scanned the distance ahead, searching for any hint of movement or structure. It was late in the afternoon when he saw it, at first no more than a shadow against the pale sweep of snow, then resolving into the faint outlines of buildings. The sight lent him fresh strength. He tightened his grip on the man's arm and pointed, though he wasn't sure how well the man's eyes could see at this distance. They moved on, their steps uneven but steady, the shapes growing more distinct with every passing minute. Roofs, smoke curling from chimneys, a fence half buried in snow. Marcus felt the tightness in his chest ease slightly. They had made it this far. The first person they saw was a woman crossing an open yard, her coat flaring in the wind. She stopped when she noticed them, her posture shifting from casual to alert. Marcus raised his free hand, calling out, his voice carrying across the still air. She shouted something back, words Marcus couldn't quite catch, and then turned, hurrying toward one of the buildings. Within moments, others emerged. 2 men in heavy parkas, a younger boy wrapped to his eyes in scarves. They came quickly, their boots kicking up fine powder, and Marcus felt the man beside him falter as if unsure what to make of the sudden attention. The men reached them first. Their questions came in quick bursts, laced with surprise and urgency, but Marcus shook his head, indicating that explanations could wait. He gestured to the man's condition, the thinness in his frame, the way he leaned heavily on Marcus's side. Understanding passed between them, and the group moved as one toward the nearest building. Inside, the air was blessedly warm, thick with the scent of burning wood and something cooking over a stove. The sudden change made Marcus's skin prickle, the heat almost overwhelming after so many days in the open cold. They settled the man into a chair near the fire, and someone brought blankets, wrapping him until only his face showed above the layers. Marcus crouched nearby, answering the questions that began again: where they had come from, how they had found him, how long he had been out there. He spoke in brief sentences, his focus still on the man, who was sitting very still, eyes half closed, his hands resting on the edge of the chair as though to anchor himself in the unfamiliar surroundings. It was agreed quickly that he needed medical attention beyond what the settlement could provide. Within the hour, they had arranged transport, an old snowcat kept in a shed at the edge of town. Marcus rode with him, the engine's steady growl filling the small cabin as they crossed the last stretch toward the regional clinic. There, under the sharp smell of antiseptic and the bright glare of electric light, the man was examined, warmed, and given fluids. The staff moved with a quiet efficiency, their questions as much for Marcus as for him, though he offered what little he knew. It was that evening, long after the immediate rush of care had passed, that Marcus witnessed the moment he knew would remain with him for the rest of his life. The clinic door opened, and a small group entered, faces tense with hope and disbelief. The man in the bed stirred at the sound, his eyes opening fully for the first time since they had left the wreck. One of the newcomers, a woman with deep lines of worry etched into her face, moved forward, her hands trembling. She spoke his name, a single word, and something in his expression broke open. The reunion that followed was wordless at first, all grasped hands and tearful embraces, the kind of contact that said more than any explanation could. Marcus stepped back, giving them space, feeling the tight knot in his own chest loosen. He had come to the tundra in search of something he hadn't been able to name, solitude perhaps, or clarity, and had found instead a life to carry back to the world. The questions about the wreck, about the years the man had spent inside it, could wait. There would be time for those later, in warmer rooms, with steadier voices. For now, the only truth that mattered was that he was no longer alone, that the years of isolation had ended here, in the glow of electric lights and the warmth of human touch. When Marcus finally stepped outside into the night, the cold was sharp and clean, the sky above scattered with stars. Somewhere out there, the plain still lay half buried, the snow already working to reclaim what the storm had revealed. He wondered if, in time, it would vanish entirely from sight again, taking its secrets with it. But that no longer felt like his burden to carry. He had done what he could. He had brought someone home. He stood for a while in the quiet, breathing in the frozen air, before turning back toward the building. The journey that had begun as an escape had become something else entirely, and though the road ahead in his own life was still uncertain, Marcus knew that he had crossed a boundary within himself. Some part of him had been restored in the act of saving another. And as he stepped inside, closing the door against the cold, he understood that the search he had thought would take him into the wilderness had, in the end, brought him back to himself. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you never miss any of the upcoming adventures and explorations we have planned. By subscribing, you'll always be the first to see our newest uploads, whether they're gripping tales like this one or fascinating journeys into other extraordinary places and events. After you've subscribed, don't forget to check out the next video waiting for you. It's packed with more captivating moments you won't want to miss. We also have a library of other stories and experiences ready for you to explore. So take a moment to browse through them and dive into whichever catches your interest. If you found this video compelling, informative, or inspiring, please consider sharing it with your friends, family, or anyone else who might enjoy it.
And that wraps up today's story. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far these stories reach. If this story moved you or gave you chills, give it a like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. One last thing, rate the story from 1 to 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps us bring you even better ones next time. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you being part of this storytelling journey.